Hey there, guys. All right, today we are back with some more history matters, and this time we're asking the question, why didn't Sweden join World War II? A short animated documentary. I don't really have a guess for this one, actually. Usually I have. I feel like I have some decent guesses sometimes. More often than not, I feel like I have a guess. This time I don't really have an idea. Um, I mean, like Hitler didn't really seem to care about neutrality. I think did Sweden like just give resources to Hitler, um, but then they also, helped hide Jews. They were a safe haven for Jews fleeing Hitler. I don't really know why he kind of just let them be when he probably could have invaded them because he invaded Norway, right? Like Hitler conquers Norway here. He could have taken Sweden. Like, I feel like Sweden's military is of similarity to Norway at this time, you know? I don't really got a clue. Let's go ahead and get that answer, shall we?
Throughout the Second World War in Europe, there were many neutral nations who, despite their government's intentions,
Yeah, that too. Hitler didn't really care about
were
neutrality.
unable to stay so. While some, like Finland, were able to resist, others, like Sweden, managed to avoid fighting. Given Sweden's immense natural resources, notably iron, it's even more surprising that it was left alone when the powers around it were fighting for their continued existence. Not only that, but Sweden would have been a valuable ally to whichever side it joined, which raises the question, why didn't Sweden
How would they have been valuable? Like, outside of the resources thing, was their military good enough to actually be was their military good enough despite a small size to actually be a really strong ally? Or is it because of resources and geographical location in the Baltic?
join World War II, and how did it manage to maintain its neutrality and deter aggressors? So, when the war broke out, Sweden declared itself to be a non belligerent nation. This shouldn't be surprising since Sweden had been a neutral nation since after the Napoleonic Wars. This was mostly because it was forced to hand over Swedish Pomerania to Prussia and thus had nothing binding them to mainland continental politics. Thus, by 1939, Sweden had over a century of neutral foreign policy stances behind it. It was governed at this point by Per Albin Hansson, who was doing everything in his power to keep fascist or communist sympathisers away from power. His
Mm-hmm.
government was a coalition of four major parties, and their foreign policy goals at first were simply don't get involved in the war. Yet, as many of you will be aware, the war soon came to its neighbours. Finland fought the Winter War against the USSR, and in 1940 both Denmark and Norway were conquered by Germany. For the Finnish-Soviet War, the Swedish were sympathetic to Finland, and there were even some who called for Sweden to formally get involved. Hansson resisted, and so Sweden covertly gave money and weapons to the Finns, and roughly 12,000 Swedes crossed the border to help in non-combat roles.
Damn, 12,000? Shit, that's a sizable amount of Swedes. Sweden's a population of what, back then? A couple million? Maybe? At most?
As for Denmark and Norway, Sweden wasn't willing to go to such lengths to help them resist Germany, and this was largely for economic reasons. Sweden exported masses of iron ore to Germany throughout the war,
Ah,
and given that everyone else had been conquered, there was no other customers. In case you're wondering, the reason why Germany kept buying the iron instead of simply conquering Sweden was that Hitler assumed that the Allies wouldn't bomb a neutral country. So
oh.
the only reason that Sweden was able to stay neutral was that it made concessions to both sides. For example, when Germany conquered Norway, the Swedish government allowed German troops to travel through the country.
I didn't know about that one.
They also allowed German troops to transit the country to Finland in 1941 when Germany invaded the Soviet Union. This actually led to what's called the Midsummer Crisis, where ministers panicked over what to do because they really didn't want to be seen aiding the Germans in their war with the USSR. In fact, Sweden's King Gustav V said that if the Germans weren't accommodated, then he personally would not be willing to bear the consequences. And so they allowed German troops to cross, and throughout the war, over 2 million German soldiers did so.
That's like the population of all of Sweden.
Of course, Sweden couldn't just give in to what the Germans wanted, since at that point they may as well have just been a member of the Axis. And as such, Sweden was sure to aid the Allies too. For example, it took thousands of Jewish refugees from Denmark and all over Europe, as well as giving refuge to socialists and political dissidents. And furthermore, Sweden also took to covertly training Norwegian troops in its territory. They were
Nice.
also active in conducting espionage against Germany and fed troop
Nice.
movements and industrial information to the British and the Americans. And in the end, Sweden's neutrality in the war carries a confusing legacy. Avoiding occupation and bombing was the priority for the government, and they did achieve that. They did so by facilitating German troop movements and providing it with valuable resources with which it could power its war machine. That said, what real choice did Sweden have? Denmark and Norway were conquered for reasons of strategy, and the Germans would have happily done the same to Sweden. And Sweden was sure to balance this with aiding the Allies and giving refuge to Europe's persecuted. In the end, Sweden stayed neutral by doing just enough to avoid the ire of both sides. I hope you enjoyed this episode.
Yeah, that's a tough, extremely difficult situation to be in. Because it's like, obviously from a high moral standing sort of thing, you want to say, like, oh, they should have stood up more against the Nazis. And it's like, yes, but also had they done that, then they wouldn't have been able to be a state that could hide the thousands of Jews that they were able to hide, you know? Like, it's a back and forth. It's a tough one because it's like, in one hand, they helped facilitate what the Germans were doing, what the Nazis were doing in that time period, but then at the same time, they were they were able to be left alone. You know, it's a tough one. It's a tough one. I thought this was a really good video by History Matters. I really enjoyed it. I thought they answered this really thoroughly for a 3-minute long video. I hope you guys enjoyed as well. Remember to hit that like button and subscribe for more, and I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.